A cold case from the heart of Nevada finally breaks open after decades of silence. Justice arrives at last for a crime that haunted a community since 1971. The shocking arrest has sent ripples through a town where neighbors never suspected the monster living among them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The relentless Nevada sun beat down on Lake Mead's receding shoreline, exposing secrets long submerged beneath its murky waters. Park Ranger Melissa Ortiz was conducting a routine patrol when something metallic caught her eye. The unmistakable contours of a vehicle emerging from the silty lakebed like a ghost from another era. "I've seen plenty of debris revealed by the drought," she would later tell reporters, "but nothing like this." The rusted frame of a 1970 Ford Mustang sat eerily preserved, its once vibrant paint dulled by decades underwater. When authorities arrived, the discovery took a macabre turn. Inside the vehicle lay two skeletons, their bones intertwined as if embracing through the long darkness. A delicate silver-blue necklace, remarkably intact, hung from one of the skeletal necks. The inscription ARW glinted in the harsh sunlight. News traveled through Boulder City with the speed of wildfire. By nightfall, the whispers had grown to a roar. Could these be the remains of Amy and Rachel Whitaker, the sisters who vanished without a trace in 1971? The girls whose disappearance had haunted the community for half a century? Laura Bennett arrived at the scene the following morning, her Nevada State Bureau of Investigation credentials reflecting the sunlight as she ducked under the yellow crime scene tape. The cold case investigator had built her reputation on methodical work and unflinching determination, qualities that had earned her both respect and isolation within the department. "How long has the vehicle been exposed?" she asked, kneeling beside the Mustang while pulling on latex gloves. "Best guess is 3 days," replied the local officer. "Water levels dropped another 6 inches last week." Laura nodded, studying the vehicle with practiced precision. Her eyes lingered on the necklace, knowing it would be crucial for identification. The drought that had devastated Nevada's water supply had inadvertently delivered what decades of investigation could not: tangible evidence in a case that had gone cold before she was even born. As the forensics team carefully documented the scene, Laura felt the weight of history pressing down. This wasn't just another case. The Whitaker disappearance had become local legend, the subject of countless theories and whispered accusations. She'd heard Ray Donovan, the original investigator, had never stopped searching, even after retirement. "We'll need to notify the Whitaker family," she said quietly. "What's left of it," the officer replied. Laura surveyed the bleak landscape, the receding waterline exposing more shoreline with each passing week. She wondered what other secrets Lake Mead might surrender before the drought ended, and whether Boulder City was ready for the truths that might surface alongside them. The August heat of 1971 had shimmered over Boulder City like a mirage the night Amy and Rachel Whitaker disappeared. Laura Bennett spread the faded newspaper clippings across her desk, studying the grainy black and white photos of two smiling teenagers. Amy Whitaker, 17, with her confident smile and feathered hair, and Rachel Whitaker, 15, more reserved but with the same striking eyes as her sister. They were last seen leaving the Starlight Diner around 9:30, Laura murmured to herself, tracing the timeline with her finger. The girls had told friends they were heading home after sharing milkshakes and fries. Their father, Richard Whitaker, a respected engineer at Hoover Dam, had reported them missing the following morning when neither returned. The Whitaker family had been prominent in Boulder City. Richard's position at the dam afforded them a comfortable lifestyle and social standing that few in the small community enjoyed. But that status hadn't helped when his daughters vanished. If anything, Laura noted, it seemed to have complicated matters. She pulled out the original police reports, the paper brittle with age. The investigation had been extensive. Interviews with dozens of classmates, searches of the surrounding desert, even divers checking the waters of Lake Mead. Nothing, The Mustang and its occupants had simply evaporated. What caught Laura's attention was a curious pattern in Ray Donovan's original notes. The retired officer had meticulously documented every lead, and she noticed something odd. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a vehicle matching the Whitaker girls' Mustang heading toward Nellis Air Force Base that night. Every single military-adjacent lead went cold, she whispered, arranging the files chronologically. Interviews with base personnel were suspiciously brief. Requests for surveillance footage were denied. Even the roadblocks set up by local police had conspicuous gaps near the base perimeter. Laura picked up a memo dated September 3, 1971. In it, the investigation team was instructed to redirect resources to more promising avenues of inquiry. The order came just days after Ray had requested access to the base's vehicle logs. She reached for her phone and snapped photos of the relevant documents. The connection to Nellis couldn't be coincidence. Something or someone had deliberately steered the investigation away from military involvement. In her mind's eye, Laura could see the two sisters in their Ford Mustang, windows down, music playing, unaware of what awaited them. Their family had been destroyed by their disappearance. Richard Whitaker had never recovered, according to community records. He'd become a recluse before his death in 1998. His reputation as a community pillar crumbling under the weight of grief and unanswered questions. "What happened to you?" Laura asked the faded photographs. "And why did everyone stop looking in the right places?" Ray Donovan sat in his worn leather recliner, surrounded by the silence of his modest Henderson home. At 78, his once imposing frame had diminished, but his eyes remained sharp. Haunted by the one case he could never solve, the evening news flickered on his television, showing the recovered Mustang from Lake Mead, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. The retired officer rose slowly, making his way to a closet he rarely opened. Inside, cardboard boxes lined the shelves, each labeled with case numbers, except one. This box, marked 1971 "Do Not Destroy" in faded red marker, contained his personal obsession. Unsanctioned notes, photographs, and evidence from the Whitaker sisters' disappearance. When the doorbell rang, Ray knew who it would be. Laura Bennett stood on his porch, her professional demeanor barely masking her skepticism. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Investigator Bennett from Nevada State Bureau of Investigation." "You're here about Amy and Rachel," he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Took long enough for someone to listen. The investigator followed him inside, taking in the modest surroundings, framed police commendations, sharing wall space with faded family photos. "I understand you led the original investigation." "Led it until they pulled me off," Ray corrected, his voice bitter. "The department said I was obsessed, wasting resources. But I knew something wasn't right." He gestured toward the dining table where he'd laid out his private collection of evidence. Laura approached cautiously, her initial skepticism giving way to professional curiosity as she examined his meticulous records. Handwritten witness statements contradicted official reports. Photographs showed tire tracks near the lake that matched military vehicles. Phone logs documented calls between Richard Whitaker and Nellis Air Force Base the night his daughters vanished. "Why wasn't any of this in the official file?" she asked, leafing through the yellowed papers. Ray's weathered hands trembled slightly as he pushed a folder toward her. "Because powerful men didn't want it there. Richard Whitaker had connections at Nellis. Every time I got close, someone shut me down. You kept all this for 50 years?" Laura's voice softened, recognizing the weight of guilt that had driven this man's obsession. "Those girls deserved justice," the former officer replied simply. "Their father was hiding something. Thomas Hale, too. I could feel it, but couldn't prove it." Ray lifted the box marked 1971 and placed it before Laura. "I'm too old now to finish this, but you have the authority I lost. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but burning with purpose, met hers. "Finish what I started." The forensics lab confirmed what everyone had already suspected. The remains found in the submerged Ford Mustang were indeed Amy and Rachel Whitaker. The silver-blue necklace with ARW engraved on its delicate pendant provided the definitive identification. Amy Rose Whitaker. The initials matched perfectly, and the piece of jewelry had become the silent witness to a decades-old tragedy. Margaret Wilson, a 63-year-old former classmate of Amy's, recognized the necklace immediately when it appeared on the evening news. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number displayed on screen. "I gave her that necklace for her 16th birthday," Margaret told Laura Bennett when they met at the Boulder City Police Department. "We saved up for months, all her friends together. Amy never took it off." The elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I always wondered what happened to them." Laura thanked the woman for coming forward, noting how even the smallest details could break a case wide open. Back at the lab, the investigator watched as technicians carefully processed the mud-caked Mustang. Despite 46 years underwater, Lake Mead's mineral-rich depths had preserved the vehicle in an eerie time capsule. "We've recovered something interesting," said the lead technician, holding up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a faded Super 8 film reel. Its metal canister corroded, but the film itself somehow intact, protected by its watertight case. It was wedged under the passenger seat. Laura's pulse quickened. Film from the night of the disappearance could be the breakthrough they needed. But it wasn't the only discovery. A forensic specialist approached with another bag containing what looked like a paint flake. "This was embedded in the driver's side door panel," he explained. "It's metallic green, definitely not matching the Mustang's original blue paint. Looks like transfer from another vehicle, possibly from a collision." Laura examined the flake under the lab's bright lights. "Get this analyzed immediately. I want to know what kind of vehicle this came from and how old the paint is." She carefully logged each item into evidence, knowing that every fragment told part of a story that powerful men had tried to bury. The Super 8 reel would need specialized restoration before viewing, and the paint chip required comprehensive analysis. Laura arranged for both to be processed with the highest priority. As she drove back to her office, the cold case investigator couldn't shake the feeling that Lake Mead had given up more than just bones. It had surrendered secrets, secrets that someone had assumed would remain submerged forever. The news of the Whitaker sisters' discovery rippled through Boulder City like a stone thrown into still water. By sunset, every diner, grocery store, and front porch buzzed with the same conversation. Laura Bennett watched from her unmarked vehicle as elderly residents gathered in small clusters outside the local cafe. Their faces a mixture of shock and something deeper, a collective reckoning with the past. "Let sleeping dogs lie," muttered Harold Jenkins, a 73-year-old retired dam worker, loud enough for Laura to hear as she passed. "Nothing good comes from digging up old bones." 3 women beside him nodded in solemn agreement, their eyes following the investigator with undisguised suspicion. At the community center, however, a different sentiment prevailed. Mary Ann Collins, who had shared a chemistry class with Amy Whitaker, clutched a tissue while addressing a small gathering. "Those girls deserve justice," she insisted, her voice breaking. "We've lived with whispers for 50 years. It's time for the truth." The division cut through Boulder City like a fault line. Laura received 6 calls that afternoon, 3 offering help, 3 suggesting she abandon the case. The town's mayor, initially supportive, now hedged his position, emphasizing the complex emotions involved and the need to respect all perspectives. Local television crews descended on Lake Mead's receding shoreline, their satellite vans creating an impromptu media village. The evening broadcast featured grainy yearbook photos of the sisters, Amy with her confident smile, Rachel looking shyly away from the camera, juxtaposed with images of the rusted Mustang being winched from the lakebed. Sources close to the investigation suggest foul play, announced a polished reporter from Las Vegas, standing where the water had once been deep enough to hide secrets for half a century. By morning, someone had placed flowers at the former Whitaker home, now owned by a young family unconnected to the case. Social media exploded with memories, theories, and accusations. Laura's supervisor called, reminding her to maintain appropriate professional distance from the community's reaction. "This town has built its identity on being safe and wholesome," Ray Donovan warned Laura over coffee at his Henderson home. The retired officer's hands trembled slightly as he pushed a folder of notes across the table. "They'll fight you to keep that image intact, even if it means burying the truth again." Laura nodded, understanding the resistance wasn't just about protecting potential suspects, but preserving Boulder City's carefully cultivated narrative. As she drove back to her temporary office, she passed a church marquee reading "Pray for Healing and Truth," the words seeming to contradict each other in this context. She steeled herself for the long road ahead, knowing that in cold cases, the most formidable obstacles weren't missing evidence or faded memories, but the community's desire to protect its own mythology, a resistance sometimes stronger than the pursuit of justice itself. The email from the forensics lab arrived at 3 in the morning, but Laura Bennett had been awake anyway, reviewing old case notes. Her heart raced as she scanned the results. The metallic green paint chip recovered from the Mustang's interior matched exactly with a specific shade used exclusively on military vehicles at Nellis Air Force Base between 1969 and 1973. "This is it," she whispered to herself, scrolling further down the report. The DNA analysis had yielded an even more significant breakthrough. Genetic material preserved on the Mustang's steering wheel had been cross-referenced with a database of military personnel. The system had found a match with Thomas Hale, a 78-year-old Air Force veteran, now living in Henderson. Laura pulled up Hale's file on her laptop. His military record showed he had been stationed at Nellis during the exact time frame when Amy and Rachel Whitaker disappeared. The investigator stared at his service photo, a young man with a stern expression and perfectly pressed uniform. Nothing in his subsequent career suggested involvement in anything criminal. After 27 years of decorated service, he had retired with honors and settled into a quiet life just 30 minutes from Boulder City. By morning, Laura had compiled enough evidence to convince a judge. The paint evidence created a direct link between the crime scene and Nellis, while the DNA put Thomas Hale physically inside the vehicle where 2 teenage girls had been found dead. The warrant was approved by noon. "We need to move quickly," she told her team, "before word gets out." Ray Donovan called as she was preparing to leave. The retired officer sounded breathless when Laura shared the news. "Thomas Hale," he repeated, the name clearly triggering something. "I interviewed him back then. He claimed he barely knew the Whitaker family, but Richard vouched for him. Said they were just acquaintances through the dam project." "Well, his DNA says otherwise," Laura replied. "I'm heading to his house now." "Be careful," Ray cautioned. Men with military backgrounds and secrets don't surrender them easily. As her vehicle approached Henderson, Laura mentally prepared for the confrontation ahead. This wasn't just another arrest. It was the unraveling of a mystery that had haunted Boulder City for half a century. Whatever they found in Hale's home would forever change how the community viewed its history and heroes. She parked outside a modest single-story house with a meticulously maintained garden and an American flag hanging beside the door. The warrant felt heavy in her pocket as she approached the entrance, knowing that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no going back for anyone involved. Laura Bennett parked her government-issued vehicle in front of Thomas Hale's modest Henderson home, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. The 78-year-old veteran had agreed to the interview, though his voice had trembled slightly over the phone. As a cold case investigator with the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation, Laura had interviewed countless suspects, but this one felt different. The weight of nearly 50 years of silence hung in the air. Thomas opened the door before she could knock, his weathered face arranged in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Investigator Bennett, please come in," he said, his hand visibly shaking as he gestured toward the living room. The interior was immaculately kept, a testament to military discipline that had never left him. Laura's gaze swept across walls, adorned with framed photographs of a younger Hale in uniform, service medals displayed in glass cases, and a meticulously folded American flag in a triangular display box. "Quite the collection," Laura remarked, noting how the veteran's eyes followed her assessment of his memorabilia. 30 years at Nellis," he replied, pride momentarily overriding his nervousness. "Would you like some coffee?" Laura declined politely, settling into an armchair as Thomas lowered himself onto the sofa across from her. His hands fidgeted with the edge of a throw pillow. "Mr. Hale, I'm investigating the discovery at Lake Mead, the Whitaker sisters." She watched his reaction carefully, noting how his posture stiffened. "Records show you were stationed at Nellis in 1971 when they disappeared." "That was a long time ago," Thomas murmured, his gaze dropping to the carpet. "I remember hearing about it, of course. Everyone did." "And did you know Richard Whitaker personally?" Laura pressed, removing a photograph from her folder. The veteran's eyes darted toward a door at the far end of the hallway, locked with a deadbolt that seemed excessive for a basement entrance, before returning to her face. "We met at community events, nothing more." Laura noticed a slight tremor in his left hand as he reached for a glass of water. "That's interesting," he said evenly, "because we found evidence suggesting otherwise." Thomas's breathing quickened. "What evidence?" "DNA on the steering wheel of the Mustang," Laura said, watching his face pale, "and paint from a military vehicle inside the car, the kind used at Nellis during that period." The old man's fingers tightened around his water glass. "I think I'd like to call my lawyer now." Laura nodded, her suspicions hardening into certainty as she glanced again toward the basement door. Whatever secrets Thomas Hale had kept for nearly 5 decades, they were unraveling, and the locked door downstairs might hold the final pieces of the puzzle that had haunted Boulder City for generations. Laura Bennett hesitated at the threshold of Thomas Hale's basement door. The stale air carried decades of secrets as she descended the creaking wooden stairs, flashlight in hand. The basement was meticulously organized, almost suspiciously so, with labeled boxes stacked against concrete walls. "Check everything," she instructed her team. "Every folder, every container." 3 hours into the search, a junior officer called Laura over to a metal filing cabinet tucked behind an old workbench. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper and stored in a humidity-controlled box, was the missing Super 8 film reel mentioned in Ray Donovan's notes. Laura's heart raced as she carefully bagged the evidence. "Ma'am, you should see this," called another investigator, pointing to a locked trunk beneath a dusty American flag. The lock gave way easily to their tools, revealing stacks of military documents, all bearing the Nellis Air Force Base insignia. Laura pulled on latex gloves before lifting the first folder. Inside were vehicle logs, meticulously maintained and signed by Thomas himself. One entry stood out immediately. August 17th, 1971, the night Amy and Rachel Whitaker disappeared. Thomas had checked out a military truck at 8:45 p.m. and returned it at 3:22 a.m. "This was never in the original case file," Laura whispered, remembering Ray's frustration at the military's stonewalling. Ray knew they were hiding something. Deeper in the trunk, Laura found personnel records, security clearance documents, and internal memos, all seemingly unrelated, until she spotted a handwritten note paper-clipped to a confidential report. The handwriting was elegant but hurried. "Thomas, we must protect our honor. The girls deserve peace, and so does our community. I've arranged everything as discussed. Richard W." Laura sat back on her heels, the implications washing over her. Richard Whittaker, the grieving father, whose daughters had vanished, had been involved in covering up their disappearance. And Thomas Hale, the respected veteran, had helped him. "Get the forensic team down here," Laura ordered. "I want fingerprints, DNA, document analysis, everything." As the team worked, Laura noticed a small leather-bound journal wedged between two boxes. Inside were handwritten entries dating back to 1971, including one from the week after the disappearance. W transferred funds today. God forgive me, but what choice did I have? The damage was done. Laura closed the journal, feeling the weight of history in her hands. The basement had given up its secrets, a conspiracy of silence between two men, one a grieving father, the other a loyal friend. Both had betrayed not just the law, but the very community that had trusted them. Upstairs, Thomas Hale sat in his living room, staring blankly at the wall as officers cataloged his possessions. The truth, buried for nearly 50 years, was finally surfacing. Laura Bennett held her breath as the lab technicians worked their magic on the decades-old Super 8 film. The forensic imaging team had spent 3 days carefully restoring and digitizing the fragile reel discovered in Thomas Hale's basement. Now gathered around a high-definition monitor in the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation lab, they were about to witness history unfold. "We've stabilized it as much as possible," explained the lead technician, adjusting his glasses. "But fair warning, the quality isn't great." The footage flickered to life, grainy and washed out, yet unmistakably showing the moonlit shores of Lake Mead. Laura leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The timestamp in the corner read August 9th, 1971, the night the Whittaker sisters vanished. Two men appeared in frame, struggling with a vehicle that was instantly recognizable as the recently recovered Mustang. One man's face was clearly visible in the moonlight, Richard Whittaker, the girl's father. His features were contorted with effort and something else, a cold determination that sent shivers down Laura's spine. "Pause it there," she commanded, pointing at the screen. "That's Richard Whittaker. No question." The second man remained partially obscured, his back to the camera as they positioned the sports car at the edge of a steep embankment. Laura watched, transfixed with horror, as they removed rocks that had apparently been used to block the wheels. The Mustang began to roll, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. "They didn't even push it," whispered Ray Donovan, who had insisted on being present. The retired officer's voice cracked with emotion. "They just let it go." The vehicle plunged into the dark waters, creating a splash that momentarily obscured the camera's view. When the surface settled, only ripples remained where the Mustang had disappeared. The two men stood watching for several minutes before turning to leave. For a brief moment, the second man's face caught the moonlight. "Freeze that frame," Laura ordered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The technician enhanced the image, cleaning it up as much as possible. Though blurry, the features were distinct enough for comparison. "We can match this against Hale's military ID from '71, said the forensic analyst, already pulling up the reference photo. The comparison was projected side by side on the screen. The jawline, the distinctive nose, the set of the eyes, all matched Thomas Hale's younger self. Laura exhaled slowly, the weight of what she was witnessing settling on her shoulders. "We've got them both. This isn't just evidence of disposal. This is them actively covering up whatever happened to those girls." Ray nodded grimly. 46 years. But the lake finally gave up its secret. Laura Bennett sat motionless at her desk, staring at the financial documents her partner, Mark Reeves, had just placed before her. The yellowed bank statements from First Nevada Bank, dated August 1971, told a story more damning than any confession. "Look at this," Mark said, pointing to a line item. $20,000 transferred from Richard Whittaker's personal account to Thomas Hale 3 days after the girls disappeared. The memo line just says, "Consulting services." She ran her fingers over the faded ink. 20,000 in 1971. That would be well over $130,000 today. Far too much for any legitimate service, especially between an engineer and an Air Force serviceman with no business relationship. Richard made sure to space it out in 2 payments, she noted, flipping to the second statement. 10,000 initially, then another 10,000 2 weeks later. He was careful. The cold case investigator felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just evidence. It was motive crystallized on paper. The transaction formed a direct line between Whitaker and Hale, connecting them in a conspiracy that had remained hidden for nearly 5 decades. The Bureau's financial analyst confirmed there were no other payments between them before or after, Mark added. This was a one-time deal. Laura leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights of the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation office humming overhead. The paper trail was tightening around Thomas Hale like a noose. What had initially seemed like a loyal friend helping cover up an accident now looked increasingly like a calculated financial arrangement. "We need to get a warrant for Hale's financial records from that period," she said. "I want to know exactly what he did with that money." As she organized the documents into her case file, Laura realized the investigation had shifted fundamentally. She wasn't just pursuing the truth about how Amy and Rachel Whitaker died. She was unraveling a complex web of loyalty, betrayal, and blood money. The payment explained why the case had gone cold so quickly in 1971. It explained why Ray Donovan had been stonewalled at every turn. It explained why 2 teenage girls could vanish without a trace while an entire community looked the other way. Laura closed the file and stared out the window toward Lake Mead, visible in the distance. The waters that had kept this secret for decades were now receding, exposing not just bones and metal, but the dark bargains made by men who valued reputation above justice. "Call Clark County District Attorney's Office," she told Mark, her voice steady with resolve. "Tell them we've established financial motive. And then call Ray. He deserves to know we're getting close." The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast harsh shadows across Thomas Hale's weathered face. For 3 hours, Laura Bennett had methodically laid out the evidence: the paint chip matching the military vehicle, the bank records showing the substantial payment, and finally, the damning Super 8 footage. "I can't keep doing this," Thomas finally whispered, his shoulders slumping forward. Tears welled in his eyes as decades of buried guilt surfaced. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The elderly veteran's confession came in broken fragments. According to Hale, Richard Whitaker had been arguing with Amy that August night in 1971. The engineer had discovered his 17-year-old daughter planned to leave Boulder City with a boyfriend Richard disapproved of. Richard was always obsessed with appearances, Thomas explained, his voice quavering. When Amy threatened to expose some of his indiscretions at the dam project, he lost control. He struck her, just once, but she fell against the corner of the desk. Laura remained silent, letting him continue. The old man described how Rachel had witnessed everything and became hysterical. In the chaos that followed, she too had been fatally injured. "Richard called me in a panic. We served together at Nellis. He knew I had—" Thomas dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. "He promised nobody would ever know. Said it was an accident, that his whole life would be destroyed." The investigator watched as Hale described driving the military truck to the Whitaker home, helping Richard load the sisters' bodies into their Mustang, then pushing the vehicle into Lake Mead's depths. $20,000, Laura said flatly. "That's what a consulting fee looks like?" Thomas flinched. "I never wanted the money. Richard insisted, said it would make me complicit, ensure my silence." "And the film?" she pressed. "Insurance. I filmed it secretly. If Richard ever tried to pin it all on me—" His voice trailed off. Laura leaned forward. "You're still trying to minimize your role, Thomas. You helped conceal a double homicide. You watched a grieving mother search for her daughters for years while you stayed silent. Richard was the one who—" "Richard is dead," she interrupted sharply, "and you've had 46 years to come forward." The veteran's eyes dropped to his trembling hands. "What happens now?" Laura Bennett stood, gathering her files. She recognized the calculated self-preservation in his story, blaming the dead man who couldn't defend himself, portraying himself as merely loyal rather than complicit. "Now," she said, "you'll be formally charged, and Amy and Rachel Whitaker will finally get justice." The arrest of Thomas Hale sent shockwaves through Boulder City, fracturing the community like a stone through glass. The morning after his arrest, locals gathered at Milo's diner, their hushed conversations punctuated by occasional outbursts as neighbors who had known each other for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an invisible line. "Tom served this country for 27 years, argued Frank Denton, pounding his fist on the counter. "You think a decorated veteran just wakes up one day and decides to help hide bodies? There's more to this story." Across town, candlelight vigils for Amy and Rachel Whitaker drew crowds of supporters who demanded justice regardless of Hale's military record. Handmade signs bearing faded yearbook photos of the sisters appeared on lawns and storefronts, a silent rebuke to those defending the veteran. Laura Bennett found herself caught in the crossfire. Walking into the local grocery store, she noticed how conversations stopped when she passed by. Some residents nodded respectfully or whispered thanks, while others glared openly. An elderly woman grabbed her arm near the produce section. "My husband served with Tom at Nellis," she hissed. "You're destroying a good man's reputation for what? To make a name for yourself?" The cold case investigator maintained her composure, but each confrontation wore her down. Even at the bureau, support was waning. Director Michaels called her into his office, his expression grave as he closed the door. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Bennett," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've got calls from 3 congressmen and a general at Nellis. They're concerned about the direction of your investigation." Laura stood her ground. "With respect, sir, I'm following evidence, not direction." "Just tread carefully," Michaels warned. "Military affairs have some complications. Historical cases involving Nellis personnel require special handling." That evening, Laura returned home to find her mailbox stuffed with letters, some supportive, others threatening. One envelope contained only a photograph of her house with a red X drawn across it. She locked her doors, drew the blinds, and poured herself 2 fingers of whiskey. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ray Donovan. "They tried to silence me in '71. Don't let them do it to you now." A local newspaper ran competing editorials. The Boulder City Chronicle's front page featured dueling perspectives: hero or accomplice, the 2 faces of Thomas Hale. Online comment sections became battlegrounds where decades-old grievances resurfaced alongside fresh accusations. As Laura reviewed her case notes that night, she realized that uncovering the truth about the Whitaker sisters wasn't just about solving a cold case. It was challenging Boulder City to confront its own complicity in decades of silence. Ray Donovan stepped into the witness box, his weathered hands gripping the railing as he faced the packed courtroom. After 46 years of carrying the burden of an unsolved case, the retired officer's moment of vindication had finally arrived. His testimony about the Whitaker sisters' disappearance silenced the room. "I was ordered to stand down," Ray stated, his voice steady despite his 78 years. "A colonel from Nellis Air Force Base called my captain directly. Next morning, I was reassigned and told the military angle was a dead end." Laura Bennett watched from the prosecution table, a mixture of pride and relief washing over her. The mentor who had handed her that dusty box marked 1971 "Do Not Destroy" was now the linchpin in their case. When Ray described how military officials had stonewalled his investigation, jurors leaned forward, captivated by his unflinching account. "I knew something was wrong when Richard Whitaker's alibi came through military channels," he continued. "But in those days, questioning Nellis meant questioning patriotism itself. After court adjourned, Ray and Laura walked the sun-baked sidewalks of Boulder City. The former detective moved slower now, but his determination remained undiminished. "They're coming after you, aren't they?" he asked, nodding toward the bureau offices in the distance. Laura nodded. "My supervisor suggested I take a leave of absence. Said I was creating unnecessary tensions with valued institutional partners." Ray chuckled without humor. Same playbook, different decade. His public testimony had transformed the case in the eyes of the community. Elderly residents who remembered the Whitaker girls approached them on the street, sharing long-suppressed suspicions and thanking them for their courage. The local newspaper, initially hostile to Laura's investigation, ran an editorial praising Ray's integrity and questioning why the truth had been buried for so long. That evening, they sat in Ray's modest Henderson home, surrounded by case files and coffee mugs. The retired officer pushed a folder across the table. "My pension paperwork," he explained. "They threatened to review it back in '71. Said my mental fitness might be in question if I kept pushing." Laura understood the weight of what he'd risked, then and now. His mentorship had given her the strength to withstand the mounting pressure from her superiors, who were increasingly uncomfortable with the military connection. "You could have stayed quiet," she said. "Enjoyed your retirement." Ray Donovan shook his head, blue eyes clear and determined. "Some silences cost too much. I couldn't take mine to the grave." As darkness fell over Nevada, 2 generations of investigators continued their work, united by a shared commitment to truth that transcended badges, bureaucracy, and time itself. Laura Bennett stared at the official Nellis Air Force Base letterhead, her frustration mounting with each carefully worded rejection. 3 weeks of requests had yielded nothing but bureaucratic evasion. The latest response cited matters of historical national security and protection of personnel reputations as grounds for denying access to records from 1971. "They're protecting dead men," she muttered, tossing the letter onto her desk. The cold case investigator had hit a wall that even her Nevada State Bureau credentials couldn't breach. Colonel James Harrington, the current liaison officer, had been polite but immovable during their meeting yesterday. "Miss Bennett," he had said with practiced neutrality, "these records pertain to operations during a sensitive period in our nation's history. The fact that the principals are deceased doesn't change classification protocols." Laura knew the real reason. No military institution wanted to admit its personnel had helped cover up the deaths of 2 teenage girls. The Whitaker sisters deserved better than bureaucratic stonewalling. Her phone buzzed. Ray Donovan's name appeared on the screen. "I might have something," the retired officer said without preamble. "Remember that secretary I mentioned? Margaret Wilkins? She kept her own copies of certain communications." Hope flickered as Laura grabbed her keys. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Ray's modest Henderson home was cluttered, but organized in its own way. He handed her a yellowed envelope with trembling hands. "Margaret passed last year. Her son found this while clearing her house and remembered I'd been asking questions." Inside was an internal memo dated September 3rd, 1971. Laura's heart raced as she read the typewritten text. "Detective Raymond Donovan to be removed from all investigative activities concerning Nellis personnel. Effective immediately by order of Colonel Walter Simmons." "This is it," Laura whispered. "Direct proof they interfered with your investigation." Ray nodded grimly. Walter Simmons was Thomas Hale's commanding officer. They played golf together every Sunday. The document was a bombshell, concrete evidence of institutional interference. It validated Ray's 46-year claim that he'd been deliberately sidelined. More importantly, it established a pattern of obstruction that extended beyond Thomas Hale to the highest levels of Nellis command. Laura carefully photographed the memo, then placed it in an evidence bag. "This changes everything. The prosecution can use this to show conspiracy beyond just Hale and Richard Whitaker." "They'll fight it," Ray warned. "Military doesn't like admitting mistakes." "Let 'em," Laura replied, determination hardening her voice. The Whitaker sisters have waited long enough. This memo proves what we've suspected. This wasn't just about two men covering up an accident. This was institutional. As she drove back to her office, Laura felt a shift in the case's momentum. The wall of silence was finally cracking, one document at a time. Laura Bennett stood in the cereal aisle of Boulder City's only supermarket, pretending not to notice how Marjorie Wilkins, who had once invited her to neighborhood barbecues, hurriedly pushed her cart in the opposite direction. This had become the new normal as the trial date for Thomas Hale approached. The cold case investigator had uncovered truths that many in the community preferred to keep buried alongside Amy and Rachel Whitaker. Back in her car, she checked her phone to find 3 new emails with no subject lines. The first read, "Some cases should stay cold." The second, "Military heroes deserve respect, not witch hunts." The third simply stated, "Watch your back." Laura deleted them all, adding them mentally to the growing collection of threats she'd received since Hale's arrest. At home that evening, surrounded by case files and takeout containers, she pulled out an old photograph of her father. James Bennett had been a detective too, obsessed with a kidnapping case he never solved. She remembered how the failure had hollowed him out, turning him into a ghost long before his heart finally gave out. The parallels weren't lost on her. The isolation, the obsession, the cost. "I won't end up like you, Dad," she whispered to the photograph. "I'm seeing this through." Her phone rang, Ray Donovan calling to check in. The retired officer had become her only true ally in recent weeks. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gruff with concern. "The town's turned against me," Laura replied. "Even people at the bureau are keeping their distance. Nobody wants to be associated with a woman who's tarnishing the reputation of a decorated veteran." "They'll come around when the truth is fully exposed," Ray assured her. "I lived with this for 46 years. You can handle a few more weeks." After hanging up, Laura opened her laptop and reviewed her testimony once more. The evidence was solid. The Super 8 film, the paint chip from the military vehicle, the bank records showing Richard Whitaker's payment to Hale. Yet doubt crept in during these quiet moments. What if the jury sympathized with the elderly veteran? What if the military stonewalling created enough reasonable doubt? She walked to her window, looking out at the distant shimmer of Lake Mead under moonlight. Somewhere out there, 2 teenage sisters had spent decades in a watery grave, while the men responsible lived full lives, protected by badges and medals and community respect. "I won't let you down," Laura whispered, uncertain whether she was speaking to the Whitaker sisters, to Ray, to her father's memory, or to herself. The trial would begin in 3 days, and she would either bring justice to Boulder City or join the ranks of those broken by the weight of unfinished truth. The Clark County Courthouse buzzed with tension as Thomas Hale's trial began on a sweltering Tuesday morning. Spectators packed the wooden benches, their collective whispers creating a constant hum beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. Laura Bennett sat rigidly at the prosecution table, her gaze fixed on the evidence folders containing 46 years of secrets. When the Super 8 film played on the courtroom's projection screen, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The grainy footage, authenticated by 3 separate forensic experts, showed Richard Whitaker and another man, unmistakably Thomas Hale, struggling with the Mustang at Lake Mead's edge. The prosecutor, a stern woman with 20 years of experience, let the silent images speak volumes as jurors leaned forward in their seats. The defendant wasn't just an innocent bystander, she argued, pointing toward the elderly veteran who sat hunched at the defense table. He was an active participant in concealing the deaths of 2 teenage girls and in helping a desperate father escape justice. Hale's attorney, a former military lawyer with silver hair and an impressive record of acquittals, approached the jury box with measured steps. "My client was a decorated serviceman caught between loyalty and an impossible moral choice," he countered. "Thomas acted out of misplaced duty to a friend in crisis, not malice." Laura's testimony came on the 3rd day. She recounted finding the paint chip in the vehicle, the military log showing Hale had checked out a truck that matched the paint's composition, and the damning bank records revealing Richard's payment. The courtroom fell silent as she described the letter found in Hale's basement. "We must protect our honor," written in Richard Whitaker's distinctive handwriting. "In your professional opinion," the prosecutor asked, "was this a premeditated cover-up?" "Without question," Laura replied, her voice steady despite the weight of dozens of hostile stares from Hale's supporters. Outside the courthouse, Boulder City residents gathered in opposing groups. Veterans in military caps held signs supporting their brother-in-arms, while others, many friends of the Whitaker family, demanded justice for Amy and Rachel. Local television crews captured the division, broadcasting images of neighbors arguing on the courthouse steps. Ray Donovan attended every day of the trial, sitting directly behind Laura. The retired officer's presence served as both moral support and living testimony to how long the truth had been buried. When their eyes met across the courtroom, a silent understanding passed between them. This case was bigger than two lost girls. It was about the power of institutions to hide inconvenient truths. As closing arguments approached, the forensic evidence mounted against Hale. The prosecution methodically connected each piece, the film, the payment, the military records, into a devastating timeline of conspiracy. The community watched, increasingly divided, as the case systematically exposed the corruption beneath their town's carefully maintained facade. After 5 days of tense deliberation, the jury returned to the packed Clark County courthouse. Laura Bennett sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air felt electric as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. "We find the defendant, Thomas Hale, guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to conceal a crime." The courtroom erupted. Supporters of the elderly veteran gasped in disbelief, while others nodded in grim satisfaction. Judge Marlene Winters called for order, her gavel striking 3 times before the room quieted. Thomas stood motionless, his military posture finally breaking as his shoulders slumped forward. "Justice comes late, but it comes," Ray Donovan whispered to Laura, his weathered face showing both relief and sorrow. Outside the courthouse, Boulder City had become a town divided. News vans lined the street as reporters thrust microphones toward anyone willing to speak. "He served his country with honor," argued a tearful woman, clutching a veteran's support sign. 20 feet away, a group of former classmates of the Whitaker sisters held photographs of Amy and Rachel, their young faces frozen in time. When Thomas emerged in handcuffs, flanked by officers, the crowd's reaction was immediate. Boos and cheers collided in the desert air. The former airman kept his eyes downcast as he was guided toward the waiting vehicle. His medals and service record couldn't shield him from accountability. Not anymore. Back in her office, Laura sorted through the final case notes. The sentencing would come later, but for the elderly man, even a minimum sentence might mean spending his remaining years behind bars. The investigator felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that the truth had finally surfaced. That evening, a small memorial appeared at Lake Mead's shoreline. Residents placed flowers and notes where the Mustang had been discovered. The Whitaker family, distant cousins, and a nephew who had never known Amy and Rachel stood together in silence as the setting sun painted the water copper and gold. "For 46 years this town whispered about those girls," said an elderly woman who had been their high school teacher. "Now they can rest, and so can we." The verdict made national headlines. Cold case solved. Military veteran convicted in decades-old cover-up. Beneath the sensational headline lay the real story of 2 young lives cut short, of a father's desperate attempt to preserve his reputation, and of a community that had chosen comfortable silence over uncomfortable truth. As darkness fell over Boulder City, Laura drove home along empty streets. The case was closed, but its echoes would reverberate through this desert community for generations to come. Laura Bennett's triumph in solving the decades-old Whitaker case left her standing in a peculiar no-man's land. The guilty verdict against Thomas Hale had split Boulder City down the middle. Half the town hailed her as a champion of justice, while the other half condemned her as the woman who destroyed a veteran's legacy and dragged their community's name through the mud. Walking through the grocery store had become an exercise in awkward encounters. Former acquaintances would either approach with effusive praise or suddenly find the cereal boxes fascinating when they spotted her. Her phone alternated between congratulatory messages and anonymous texts suggesting she leave town. Even her desk at the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation had become a battleground of sorts. Some colleagues left coffee and congratulatory notes, while others maintained a chilly professional distance. "You knew this would happen," her supervisor had told her during their post-case review. "Cases like this, they change things. People don't like having their heroes exposed as villains." Laura had simply nodded. She had known, of course, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different animals. The most painful blow came from within her department. The investigation had exposed uncomfortable connections between local law enforcement and military authorities, relationships that had facilitated decades of silence. Several senior officials now faced internal reviews, and the resulting tension had transformed Laura from rising star to uncomfortable reminder. Even Ray Donovan, despite his vindication, advised caution. "They'll never forgive you for being right," the retired officer had told her over coffee. "But you'll never forgive yourself if you'd stayed silent." One cold afternoon, Laura drove out to Lake Mead alone. The winter rains had begun to replenish the drought-stricken reservoir, slowly covering the exposed shoreline where the Mustang had been discovered. She stood at the water's edge, hands thrust deep in her coat pockets against the chill. The truth had cost her, professionally, personally, socially. Yet watching the gentle waves lap at the shore, Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. Amy and Rachel Whitaker had finally received justice. Their story was no longer buried beneath water and lies. A text message vibrated in her pocket. Another case file, another mystery waiting. Laura took one last look at the lake before turning back toward her vehicle. The water would continue to rise, covering the evidence of past crimes, but the truth had already surfaced, and that, she decided, was worth whatever price she had to pay. Ray Donovan sat on his porch swing, watching the Nevada sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. For the first time in decades, his shoulders weren't hunched with the weight of unsolved questions. The Whitaker sisters' case had haunted him since 1971, but now, finally, the truth had surfaced from Lake Mead's depths. "I can sleep now," he told Laura Bennett when she visited his Henderson home. The retired officer's eyes, once clouded with guilt, now reflected a hard-won peace. He had placed the newspaper clipping announcing Thomas Hale's conviction in a frame, not as a trophy, but as confirmation that persistence eventually yielded justice. The remaining Whitaker family members gathered at a small ceremony where the state officials delivered a formal apology. Cousins, distant relatives, and childhood friends of Amy and Rachel stood in solemn silence as the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation acknowledged the institutional failures that allowed their case to remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. "We failed these young women," the Bureau director admitted, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "And we failed their family by allowing powerful interests to obstruct justice." Laura watched from a respectful distance, knowing her presence might stir mixed emotions. The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about Richard Whitaker, once considered a pillar of the community. His descendants now carried the burden of his betrayal alongside their grief for Amy and Rachel. In Washington, the ripples continued spreading. A congressional committee announced a federal inquiry into historical cover-ups involving military installations, with Nellis Air Force Base as its starting point. Documents that had been classified for national security were scheduled for review, promising to expose other instances where influence had trumped truth. Boulder City itself remained divided. Some residents placed flowers at the shoreline where the Mustang had been discovered. Others maintained that the past should have remained buried. The local newspaper ran profiles of both victims, attempting to reclaim their humanity from decades of whispered speculation. For Ray, the resolution brought an unexpected gift: friendship. He and Laura met weekly for coffee, the generational gap between them bridged by shared commitment to justice. The cold case investigator had found in him not just a mentor, but a kindred spirit who understood the cost of challenging powerful institutions. "You did what I couldn't," he told her one afternoon. "You finished what I started." Laura shook her head. "We did it together," she replied. "Your notes made this possible." The State Police Academy announced a new ethics course named after the Whitaker sisters, ensuring future generations of officers would study how easily justice could be derailed and how doggedly it must be pursued. The legacy of silence that had protected the guilty was finally shattered, replaced by a commitment to accountability that would outlive them all. Laura Bennett stood at the edge of Lake Mead, watching the crimson sunset paint the water in shades of amber and gold. The desert air had cooled with evening's approach, bringing a stillness that seemed appropriate for this moment of reflection. After months of controversy, threats, and sleepless nights, the case that had consumed her life was finally closed. She knelt at the shoreline, a single white lily in her hand. The flower had been Ray Donovan's suggestion, something pure to honor the memory of two young lives cut tragically short. Laura gently placed it on the water's surface, watching as ripples carried it away from shore. "For Amy and Rachel," she whispered, thinking of the Whitaker sisters whose bones had emerged from these waters after 46 years of silence. Their silver-blue necklace with the ARW inscription had been returned to their remaining family members, distant cousins, who had never stopped wondering what happened to the girls. The investigator stood, brushing sand from her knees. In the distance, she could see the outline of Hoover Dam, where Richard Whitaker had once worked as a respected engineer. His reputation, like so many others, had crumbled under the weight of truth. The community was still processing how a father could cover up his daughter's deaths, how a decorated veteran like Thomas Hale could be complicit in such deception. Her phone buzzed, a message from Ray. The former officer had found peace at last, his decades of guilt finally lifted. "Thank you," his text read simply. Laura smiled. Their unlikely partnership had weathered the storm of public opinion and institutional resistance. The federal inquiry into historical cover-ups at Nellis Air Force Base was proceeding, despite military stonewalling. Documents were being declassified, testimonies recorded. What had happened to the Whitaker sisters would never happen again, at least not with the same impunity. Walking back to her vehicle, Laura noticed a familiar figure waiting near the parking area. It was one of Boulder City's oldest residents, a woman who had once been Amy's classmate. "I brought these," the woman said, holding out a bundle of faded photographs. "Thought someone should remember them as they were." Laura accepted the photos with a nod of gratitude. The images showed two smiling teenagers, frozen in time, unaware of what awaited them. "The town will heal," the woman added. "Truth usually hurts before it helps." As Laura drove away from Lake Mead, she felt something shift within her, a burden lifting. The price of truth had indeed been high. Her reputation, relationships, even her sense of belonging had all been tested. But justice had prevailed. The lake had finally surrendered its last secret, and with it, the weight of decades of silence. For Laura, for Ray, for the Whitaker sisters, and for Boulder City itself, a chapter had closed, allowing healing to finally begin.